Now, earlier this year at Star Wars Celebration, something called Project Luminous was announced, and at the time, little more was really said about it other than multiple different authors or writers would be working on it. And quite honestly, I chalked it up to some gimmick story that may or may not turn out to be good when it eventually comes out, and I've given it very little thought since then. However, this past weekend at New York Comic Con, we learned a bit more about the project, and basically what it's going to be is a collaborative effort by multiple different authors across different publishers and mediums that will tell one large cohesive story about, well, that part's a little unclear. But they did give us a bit of a teaser that used Obi-Wan's line to Luke in A New Hope, saying that the Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things, until Project Luminous. And this, of course, seems to imply or hint at that a change in what the Force is, or the way it's used or perceived, or what we know about it is coming. And I highly doubt it'll be in this Project Luminous itself, where such a big change or reveal would happen. Rather, it'll be what explores it further after we learn about it somewhere else, with the most likely and obvious choice being in Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. And just to quickly clarify here, this Project Luminous isn't like a new show or movie or trilogy or anything like that. Instead, it will be one large story that spans several different books and comics, with names like Charles Soule, who brought us the second volume of the Darth Vader comic, and Claudia Gray, who wrote Lost Stars and Bloodline, attached to the project among others. Names that, if you don't keep up with the other sources of canon, you might not be familiar with, but if you do, you'll likely agree they've brought us some quality stories in the past. Anyway, as I was saying, I don't think it'll be this story itself that reveals some sort of big change to the Force, assuming of course there is a big change coming, and that my initial gut reaction when hearing this news, that it'll most likely be a gimmick type thing, is wrong, and that this is exploring something significant. So then, assuming this is something significant, I highly doubt it'll be revealed in books and comics of all places, considering most fans never dig into the other sources of canon. Thus, any sort of big change made to the Force, or Star Wars itself even, likely wouldn't be made in stories that the average fan will never read, or that they don't want to have to read to learn about something significant or monumental happening. And so then, considering this story is set to kick off early next year, that means The Rise of Skywalker will be where we'll initially learn about this big change to the Force. Plus again, it would just be the obvious choice to do it in a movie that then might entice some people to go read these extra stories attached to it. And to go along with this possibility, we have heard from Kevin Smith that the last scene in The Rise of Skywalker will supposedly melt our minds. Not to mention, there have been other little tidbits of information, true or not, that have hinted to some sort of big reveal or ending to Episode 9, with some even speculating the Jedi will indeed be no more after this movie, or that they will become something radically different under Rey's or maybe even Ben Solo's guidance, or that they will no longer even be called Jedi, but will henceforth be called Skywalkers, which would fit with the name of Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. And one guess I have, and I'm not saying I'd necessarily love or hate it, is that Ben Solo, having learned both the dark and light sides of the Force, will somehow become the balance himself, thus fulfilling the prophecy and finishing what his grandfather started. And not that I think the movie would actually explore it, because it might be a little too confusing for some, but you could even tie it into the Mortis story arc from the Clone Wars, and he could become the new father, much like Anakin could have done so in the past, then leaving Rey behind to create some sort of new order of Force users, and that's how you could end this whole trilogy and the Skywalker saga. This then allows Ben Solo, the last Skywalker other than Leia, assuming she doesn't perish in Episode 9, to have some sort of happy ending, or to ride off into the proverbial sunset, never to likely return, which then solves the problem of him having offspring someday and continuing the Skywalker line and story. Because I think one of the biggest problems with Ben being redeemed and surviving this movie, and especially if Reylo fans get their way and they end up together, it leaves the door wide open for more Skywalkers and more movies. And they really are trying to sell this as the end of the Skywalker saga, which makes no sense if the movie then ends with Rey and Ben together. So what makes more sense to me is for Ben to make a sacrifice of some sort, and for Rey to be the one who carries on the Jedi or Skywalker name. Anyway, and even though I initially thought, and I even made a video about this, that they would play it safe with Episode 9 and give us a more or less generic story and ending, it seems like I may have been wrong in my thinking, and like they may be going for broke with The Rise of Skywalker, especially again if this Project Luminous is some sort of follow-up to a huge revelation or reveal that will happen in episode 9. And to be completely honest here, I don't know if the possibility of such a huge reveal makes me absolutely terrified or maybe a bit intrigued. I don't know that moving completely away from what you might call George Lucas Star Wars is a great idea that could actually turn things around, or the worst and possibly last mistake they ever make with the franchise. Now, my initial thought is that it would be a mistake, and a big one at that, but to be fair, a lot would depend on what the reveal is and how it's presented. Would they try to sell it off as, we've been wrong about the Force all along, or would it be presented as something has just happened, here in this sequel trilogy, that has changed what the Force once was? Because if it's not the latter, if you're going to try and say the Force has been this all along and you just didn't know it until now, I don't think I could get on board with that. Others might love it, and that's of course fine, but flat out, I feel I'm way too much of a George Lucas purist for something that radical. However, if you sell it as this has happened and the nature of the Force has changed because of it, then I'd at least be far more open to it. However, you still have the problem of ending the Skywalker saga with this huge reveal, which implies this is what the story has been building to from the start. Then again, George Lucas himself was going to do some, shall we say, interesting stuff with the sequel trilogy that likely would have radically changed our perception and or understanding of the Force, and perhaps tested my own resolve when it comes to the word of George Lucas being the absolute word of Star Wars. He was going to delve deeper into the microbiotic realm, making the Wills these organisms who fed off the Force and used living beings like vehicles. And though that certainly sounds interesting, and I would actually love to know what his ideas were just for the sake of it, I'm not sure how people would have responded to all that had they been the actual sequel trilogy, to the Force going from this very mystical energy field in the original trilogy, to learning a bit more about how it works in the prequels with midichlorians, to having it all laid bare in the sequels, and seemingly learning that the Force is a cog in the wheel of this strange, complex symbiotic system of microbiotic life forms and larger life forms, or whatever he had in mind exactly. Though, really, I think Lucas's approach with the sequel trilogy would have been to end the story, and not just the story of the Skywalkers, but to end the story of Star Wars altogether, and to finally get out all of these ideas he's had floating around in his head since back in the 70s when he started all this. And though again, I'd love to hear it and see it, and I bet it would have made for a fascinating trilogy, I don't know how well your average Star Wars fan, or even most hardcore fans, or even someone like me who considers themselves a Star Wars purist, or a Lucas purist I should say, would have reacted to all this. I mean, even just going back to the prequels, there were a lot of people who didn't like the inclusion of the midichlorians, though after episode 1, there was a lot of confusion about what they even were, with some people believing they were the Force or they generated it somehow, which isn't the case. They just facilitate travel or information between the cosmic Force and the living Force. Anyway, in other words here, changing what the Force is, and you could certainly argue the Force is Star Wars, or what makes it special compared to any other IP out there. Anyway, changing how it works or adding something to it is always going to be met with a very, very critical and skeptical eye by almost all fans. And especially after the Bob Iger book, where we learned more about how Disney and Lucasfilm decided not to go with any of George Lucas's ideas for the sequel trilogy, well, I don't know how well a huge change to the Force is going to be met right now, even if it is good and makes sense and isn't presented as some type of rewrite, or like we didn't understand what the Force was all along, until Disney Star Wars explained it to us. Because the main problem many fans have with the Disney era of Star Wars is they don't feel like what they've been getting is Star Wars, or that current Lucasfilm is just missing the mark with it, which tends to make a big change to the Force right now in Episode 9, a very risky idea, one that might chase some fans, or more fans, away for good. Because, as I've said before, I really think what the sequel trilogy should have been is them, meaning Disney and Lucasfilm, trying to prove to the fans that they can get Star Wars right, that they understand what it is and what it means to people. It should have honored the old characters while slowly but surely moving the new characters to the forefront so they could be a big part, but not the whole part, of the ultimate conclusion of this trilogy and saga. Instead, if I'm right about things here and a big change to the Force is coming in Episode 9, it may make it even feel more like what has happened before, what all the old characters accomplished just doesn't matter all that much in the end, that it's all going to come down to what Rey and Kylo Ren or Ben Solo do right now, that it's they who will finally get everything right after the heroes of old failed or gave up. And oddly enough, telling us that the new characters have to get it right because the characters from before, the ones we originally got to know and cared about and rooted for, had failed on some level, is not the best way to endear them to us. Telling me that Rey has to clean up the mistakes of Luke Skywalker and understand the Force better than him, and that Kylo Ren has to kill Palpatine once and for all and bring balance to the Force when Anakin couldn't, isn't the best way to get me to like these new characters. And even though, yes, I do hope The Rise of Skywalker can be a good movie that I enjoy, something that's a decent enough film in its own right and gives us a new, solid enough ending to the Skywalker saga, after the near perfect ending of Return of the Jedi, mind you, I really hope they don't overthink things and go all in on some crazy ending that completely changes our perception of the story all along. Like I said, if it ends in a way that changes things forever after the fact and they want to make a series of comics and books that explores that, I'll be open-minded. But if this movie ends in a way that dismantles George Lucas Star Wars and they release a series of books and comics that explores it and justifies it further, then may the Force be with them, because they'll likely need it after yet another huge backlash from a lot of fans. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me if you think Episode 9 will try to give us an ending that will redefine the Force, or if this new series of books and comics coming out will be some type of gimmick and Episode 9 won't be all that far off the rails. Whatever you think, let me know in the comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.